I walked through the front door of my childhood home, exhausted from 3 days of debugging code at a client conference in Denver, expecting to hear the familiar jingle of Charlie's collar and feel his golden fur against my legs. Instead, silence greeted me. My heart dropped into my stomach as I called his name, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. Mom appeared from the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel, wearing that expression she used to have when she broke bad news about canceled family vacations. "We sold it," she said, as casually as discussing the weather. "Your sister's kids needed new phones. You'll get over it." The words hit me like a physical blow. Charlie wasn't an it. He was my best friend, my companion through my recent breakup, my reason for staying at this house temporarily. When I asked where he was, they laughed it off. I didn't. The laughter still rang in my ears 2 hours later, as I sat in my old bedroom staring at the empty dog bed in the corner. Charlie had been sleeping there for 2 months, while I rebuilt my life after Jessica left me. Now, even that small comfort had been ripped away by the people who were supposed to love me most. Mom knocked on my doorframe, still holding that infuriating dish towel. "Bobby, you're 28 years old. It's time you learned that sometimes we have to make tough choices for family." Tough choices. I stood up so fast my desk chair rolled backward. "You sold my dog without asking me, without even telling me you were thinking about it." She shrugged, her gray hair catching the afternoon light streaming through my window. "We needed the money, and Emma's girls have been begging for those new smartphones. Madison and Morgan are starting middle school, and all their friends have them. So you sold Charlie for phone money." The words tasted bitter. "How much did you even get?" $1,600, she said proudly, as if she'd negotiated some brilliant deal. "The man who bought him seemed very nice. He had grandchildren who wanted a dog." I felt sick. $1,600. Charlie was worth more than that, just in vet bills over the past year. I'd spent $2,000 on his emergency surgery when he ate a tennis ball last summer. But more than that, he was priceless to me. He'd been my constant companion through college, through starting my software development career, through every heartbreak and celebration of my adult life. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom's expression shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see why that matters now." "Because I'm going to get him back." She laughed again, that same dismissive sound that had cut through me downstairs. "Bob, we already spent the money. Emma bought the phones yesterday." As if summoned by her name, my sister Emma burst through the front door, her voice carrying up the stairs. "Mom, where did you put the phone chargers?" Then, noticing my car in the driveway, she called up louder. "Bobby's back. How was Denver?" I couldn't answer. I was too busy pulling up Instagram on my phone, searching for anything that might give me a clue about where Charlie had gone. Emma appeared in my doorway moments later, flanked by her 12-year-old twin daughters Madison and Morgan, both clutching brand new iPhones in sparkly cases. "Uncle Bobby?" Madison squealed, waving her phone. "Look what Grandma got us!" The sight of those phones made my chest tight. Charlie's life had been traded for 2 rectangles of glass and metal that would be obsolete in 2 years. Emma noticed my expression and frowned. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her blonde hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn since high school. "He's upset about the dog," Mom explained, rolling her eyes. Emma's frown deepened. "Seriously, Bobby, you're being dramatic over a dog. Mom did us all a favor. That thing was shedding everywhere and barking at night." "Charlie never barked at night," I said through gritted teeth. "Whatever," Emma said, examining her manicured nails. "You should be grateful we helped you learn some responsibility. Maybe now you'll stop living like a college student and actually grow up." The cruelty in her words hit harder than any physical blow. This was my sister, who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms because she was scared, who I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with her homework every night in high school. Now she was looking at me like I was some pathetic child throwing a tantrum. Dad's truck pulled into the driveway, and I heard his heavy footsteps on the porch. David Martinez had worked construction for 30 years, and it showed in his weathered hands and permanent squint. He appeared in my doorway still wearing his hard hat and reflective vest. "What's all the commotion?" he asked, setting down his lunch cooler. "Bobby's having a meltdown about the dog," Emma said, air-quoting the word meltdown. Dad looked at me with the same disappointment I'd seen when I'd chosen computer science over following him into construction. "Son, you're almost 30. It's time you learned that family comes first. Those girls needed phones for school, and we all had to make sacrifices." "I didn't make any sacrifice," I said, my voice rising. "You made it for me. You sold my dog while I was working to pay for my room and board here." "Our house, our decision," Dad said firmly. "Maybe this will motivate you to get your own place faster." I stared at these people who shared my DNA, wondering when they'd become strangers. The twins were still playing with their phones, completely oblivious to the devastation their gift had caused. Emma was scrolling through social media, posting pictures of the girls with their new devices. Mom had returned to the kitchen to start dinner, humming, as if nothing had happened. That night, I lay awake searching every local Facebook group, Craigslist listing, and pet adoption site I could find. I posted Charlie's picture in lost pet groups, even though he wasn't technically lost. I called 3 animal shelters describing him in detail. Nobody had seen a golden retriever matching his description. It was past midnight when I found the first clue. A Facebook post in a pet trading group showed a video of a golden retriever that looked exactly like Charlie. The post was from an account belonging to Tyler Hendricks, a 17-year-old whose profile was full of concerning content. The video showed the dog tied to a post in a muddy backyard, with Tyler demonstrating a shock collar he'd just purchased. "Training my new dog to be more obedient," the caption read. "Previous owner spoiled him too much." I watched the 10-second video 12 times, my heart breaking more with each replay. Charlie's tail wasn't wagging. His head was down, ears flattened against his skull in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't my confident, happy dog who greeted every morning with enthusiasm and treated every person he met like a potential best friend. The timestamp on the video was from yesterday afternoon. Less than 24 hours after my family sold him, Charlie was already suffering at the hands of someone who saw him as an object to control rather than a soul to love. I screenshot the video and the profile, my hands shaking as I saved the evidence. Tyler's location was listed as Millbrook, a small town about 45 minutes west of here. His profile showed dozens of posts about training techniques for dogs, most involving punishment and dominance rather than positive reinforcement. I had found Charlie. Now I had to figure out how to bring him home. The next morning I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't concentrate on debugging JavaScript when Charlie was being tortured by some teenager with a god complex. I withdrew $2,000 from my savings account, enough to buy Charlie back and cover any inconvenience fee the Hendricks family might demand. The drive to Millbrook took me through increasingly rural countryside, past horse farms, and mobile home parks that had seen better decades. My GPS led me down a gravel road lined with rusted mailboxes and overgrown ditches. The Hendricks property sat at the end of a long driveway, a single wide trailer surrounded by broken-down cars and machinery parts. I parked behind a Ford pickup truck that had more rust than original paint, and took a deep breath before approaching the front door. A woman in her 40s answered, wearing a stained housecoat and cigarette dangling from her lips. Her graying hair was pulled back with a scrunchie, and she looked at me with suspicion. "You selling something?" she asked, not bothering to remove the cigarette. "No, ma'am, I'm actually here about a dog you recently purchased, a golden retriever named Charlie." Her expression shifted to annoyance. "If you're here to complain about noise, he's been quiet since Tyler started using the shock collar." My stomach clenched. "I'm not complaining. I'm his original owner and I'd like to buy him back. I brought cash." Janet Hendricks looked me up and down, calculating something behind her tired eyes. How much cash? $2,000, I said, pulling out the envelope. She laughed, a harsh sound that reminded me of my family's dismissive laughter yesterday. Honey, you're about 3 days too late. Tyler got bored with that dog faster than a kid gets bored with Christmas toys. We already sold him to some guy who came by Monday morning. My heart stopped. You already sold him again. $600, she said, taking a long drag from her cigarette. Dog was too much work anyway. Kept trying to get loose from his chain, wouldn't eat the cheap food we bought him. Tyler said he was defective or something. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Can you tell me who bought him? I really need to find him. Janet shrugged. Some older guy with a beat-up pickup truck. Didn't ask his name, didn't care. He had cash and wanted the dog gone that day. Said something about needing a dog for his property or something. I looked past her toward the backyard, where I could see a heavy chain still attached to a metal stake driven into the muddy ground. Food bowls sat nearby, one filled with what looked like moldy kibble, the other bone dry. The sight made me sick to my stomach. Do you remember anything else about him? What he looked like? What kind of truck? Look, kid. Janet said, her patience clearly running thin. I got 3 other dogs back there and 2 teenagers who eat everything in the house faster than I can buy it. I don't keep track of every person who shows up here with money. The dog's gone, deal with it. She started to close the door, but I stepped forward. Please, this dog means everything to me. Can you at least tell me what direction he went? East, I think, she said, already losing interest. Guy mentioned something about having property out toward the state line. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing on the sagging wooden porch with $2,000 in cash and no way to find Charlie. I walked around to the backyard to look at where he'd been kept, and the sight broke my heart even further. The chain was heavy enough to anchor a boat, and the ground around the stake was worn bare from Charlie pacing in circles. Scratch marks on nearby trees showed where he'd tried to climb or escape. I took pictures of everything, though I wasn't sure why. Evidence maybe for some future confrontation with my family about what their decision had led to, or just proof that this nightmare was really happening. The drive home felt longer than the journey out. My mind raced through possibilities. A man with property toward the state line could be anyone. There were hundreds of farms and rural properties in that direction, and Charlie could be at any of them. Or worse, he could already be on his way somewhere else if this was some kind of pattern. When I got home, my family was gathered around the dinner table laughing about something Morgan had said at school. The normalcy of the scene felt obscene after what I'd just witnessed. These people were eating Mom's pot roast and sharing stories about their day, while Charlie was God knew where, possibly being abused by his third owner in less than a week. How was work? Mom asked without looking up from her plate. I didn't go to work, I said, standing in the kitchen doorway. I went to find Charlie. The laughter stopped. Dad set down his fork and fixed me with a stern look. Bob, you need to let this go. Let it go. I pulled out my phone and showed them Tyler's video. This is what happened to him at the first place. They used shock collars on him and kept him chained in a mud pit. Emma glanced at the video and shrugged. Dogs are resilient. He'll adapt. They already sold him again. I continued, my voice getting louder. To some stranger for $600. He's been passed around like a piece of property and nobody knows where he is now. Madison looked up from her phone. Uncle Bobby, you're being really negative. Can't you just be happy for us? The innocence in her question hit me like a slap. These children had been raised to see their gift as completely separate from Charlie's suffering. To them, there was no connection between their happiness and his misery. Your happiness cost Charlie his life, I said quietly. Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. That's enough. You're upsetting the girls over an animal that you couldn't even afford to house properly. I was saving money to get my own place, I said. Charlie was temporary here while I got back on my feet after the breakup. Well, now you don't have that excuse anymore, Emma said, returning her attention to her phone. Maybe this is the push you needed to actually move on with your life. I looked around the table at these people who I'd grown up with, shared countless meals with, celebrated birthdays and holidays with. Now they were looking at me like I was an unstable stranger who'd wandered into their house. You know what? I said, heading toward the stairs. You're right. This is exactly the push I needed. I spent that night researching dog flipping operations online, learning about networks of people who buy and resell pets quickly for profit. I read horror stories about dogs being sold to fighting rings, puppy mills, and people who used them for guard dogs or worse. The more I learned, the more terrified I became about what might have happened to Charlie. But I also learned that there were ways to track these operations, ways to find patterns and connections that might lead me to my dog. It would take time, patience, and probably some risks I wasn't comfortable thinking about yet. I was going to find Charlie no matter what it took. And when I did, I was never going to let anyone hurt him again. Over the next week, I threw myself into investigating the underground network of dog reselling in our area. I created fake social media profiles to join private groups where people traded and sold animals. What I discovered made my stomach turn. There were dozens of people like Tyler and Janet Hendricks buying dogs from families who needed quick cash and then flipping them to the highest bidder within days. Most buyers didn't ask questions about where the dogs came from or where they were going. It was a shadow economy built on treating animals like disposable commodities. I found 3 other families in neighboring counties who had sold dogs to the same man Janet described. A woman named Carol Phillips had sold her elderly beagle to someone matching his description just 2 weeks ago. She was crying when she told me about it over the phone. He seemed nice enough, she said through tears. Said he had a farm and wanted a companion dog. But something felt off about him, you know. He was too eager, too quick with the cash. Carol gave me the same description Janet had: middle-aged white man beat-up pickup truck, mentioned having property towards the state line. But she added a crucial detail that Janet had missed. He had a bumper sticker, she said. Something about supporting local businesses, and there was a dent in the driver's side door like someone had hit it with a baseball bat. I added this information to the notebook I'd started keeping along with photos, timelines, and contact information for everyone I'd spoken to. My bedroom wall was starting to look like something from a crime drama covered with maps and notes connected by red string. The breakthrough came when I met Dr. Patricia Wells at the emergency animal hospital, where I'd taken Charlie for his tennis ball surgery. She was working late on a Friday night, when I stopped by with photos of Charlie and Tyler's video. "I've been a veterinarian for 20 years, she said, her kind eyes hardening as she watched the shock collar video. "And I've seen what happens to dogs when they end up in the wrong hands." She led me to her office and pulled out a file folder marked Suspected Abuse Cases. Inside were photos and reports that made me wish I'd never started this investigation. Golden retrievers are particularly vulnerable, she explained. Their gentle nature and eagerness to please make them perfect targets for people who want to exploit that trust. She showed me documentation of something called bait dogs, used in fighting rings to train aggressive dogs. The pictures were so horrific I had to look away, but she made sure I understood what Charlie might be facing. "The man you're describing sounds like Roy Martinez," she said, pulling out another file. "He's been on our radar for months, buys gentle, well-trained dogs and sells them to people who don't have their best interests at heart." My blood ran cold. What kind of people? Fighting rings mainly. They use dogs like Charlie to train their fighters. The gentle dogs never fight back, which makes them perfect for teaching aggression without risk to the valuable fighting animals. I thought I was going to be sick. Charlie, who had never shown aggression toward anything more threatening than a butterfly, was potentially being used as a living punching bag for trained killers. "Have you reported this to police?" I asked. Dr. Wells laughed bitterly. "Multiple times. They always say there's not enough evidence, or they can't get a warrant, or the tip doesn't pan out. Meanwhile, more dogs disappear every week. She gave me Roy's last known address and a description of his truck, dark blue Ford F-150 from the mid-90s, multiple dents bumper sticker for Murphy's Auto Parts. She also warned me to be careful. Roy has connections, she said. People who protect his operation in exchange for money or favors. If you're going to look for your dog, don't go alone. I drove home that night with my mind racing. My family's casual betrayal had led Charlie into a nightmare I could barely comprehend. While Emma was posting Instagram stories about the twins' new phones, and Mom was planning Thanksgiving dinner, Charlie was potentially fighting for his life in some underground horror show. When I got home, Emma was waiting in the living room with a serious expression I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. "We need to talk," she said, patting the couch beside her. I sat down reluctantly, expecting another lecture about moving on and growing up. "Bobby, I'm worried about you." She began, her voice softer than it had been all week. "Mom says you've been obsessing over this dog thing, calling strangers and driving around to weird places." "His name was Charlie," I said, "and I'm not obsessing. I'm trying to save his life." Emma sighed. "Look, I get that you loved him, but you're starting to scare the girls with all this talk about dog fighting and abuse. Madison asked me yesterday if someone was going to take their pets away. The twins had 2 cats, Sparkles and Princess, who lived pampered indoor lives and had never experienced a moment of hardship. The idea that they were worried about pet safety while being completely oblivious to their role in Charlie's suffering was almost too much to bear. "Maybe they should be scared," I said. "Maybe they should understand that their happiness came at a cost." Emma's expression hardened. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're trying to make children feel guilty about getting gifts from their grandmother. That's not healthy, Bobby. Neither is selling someone's best friend without permission." "It wasn't just someone," Emma snapped. "It was Mom's decision about Mom's house. You're a guest here, remember? You lost the right to make demands when you moved back in with your parents at 28. Her words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I had moved back home temporarily after Jessica left, and I was behind on my plan to get my own place. But that didn't give them the right to sell Charlie. "I'm going to find him," I said, standing up to end the conversation. "And then what?" Emma asked. "Let's say you track down this dog. What's your plan? Break into someone's property and steal him back, get yourself arrested, ruin your career over a pet." I didn't have a good answer to that question, which Emma clearly took as confirmation that I was being irrational. "Bobby, you need to talk to someone," she said. "This isn't normal behavior. Healthy people don't throw their lives away over animals." I left the room without responding, but her words followed me upstairs. Was I losing my mind? Was I really planning to risk everything for a dog that my own family considered disposable? I looked at the investigation wall in my bedroom, covered with maps and photos and timelines that would have made sense to a detective, but probably looked insane to anyone else. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe I was spiraling into something unhealthy and obsessive. But then I remembered the video of Charlie with his head down and ears flattened, looking defeated in a way I'd never seen before. I remembered Dr. Wells' files full of photos showing what happened to dogs like Charlie when nobody fought for them. Charlie couldn't fight for himself. He'd been bred for generations to trust humans and please them. If I didn't fight for him, nobody would. I picked up my notebook and started planning my next move. Emma could call it obsessive. My parents could call it immature. But I was going to find Roy Martinez, and I was going to bring Charlie home, even if it cost me everything. It took me 2 more weeks of following leads and staking out locations before I found Roy Martinez's operation. The address Dr. Wells had given me led to an abandoned house, but I canvassed the neighborhood until I found a woman who remembered Roy's truck parked behind the old Riverside packaging warehouse on the outskirts of town. I spent 3 nights sitting in my car across the street from that warehouse, drinking coffee from a thermos and fighting off doubt about what I was doing. Emma's words kept echoing in my head. Was I really about to risk everything for a dog? But every time I considered giving up, I thought about Charlie's trusting brown eyes and the way he used to greet me after long days at work, tail wagging so hard his whole body wiggled with joy. On the fourth night, I saw Roy's truck pull into the warehouse parking lot at 11:30. The dark blue F-150 was exactly as Dr. Wells had described, right down to the Murphy's Auto Parts bumper sticker and the dent in the driver's side door. My heart started pounding as other vehicles arrived over the next hour. Pickup trucks, SUVs, even a few expensive sedans that seemed out of place in this industrial wasteland. I waited until the parking lot was full, then crept closer on foot, staying in the shadows cast by nearby buildings. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock. But tonight, light leaked through gaps in the boards, and I could hear sounds that made my blood run cold, barking, shouting, and occasional roars of approval from what sounded like a crowd. I found a loose board on the side of the building and managed to create a gap just wide enough to peer through. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. The warehouse floor had been converted into a makeshift arena, with a circular pit surrounded by wooden bleachers packed with people shouting and waving money. In the center, 2 dogs were circling each other, both bleeding from multiple wounds. One was a scarred pit bull mix, the other looked like it might have been a family pet once upon a time. But it wasn't the fighting dogs that made me sick. It was what I saw in the shadows around the arena cages full of animals waiting their turn. Some looked like they'd been bred for fighting, all muscle and scars. Others looked like Charlie gentle breeds that had no business being in this place. I scanned the cages, frantically searching for golden fur and familiar markings. The lighting was poor, and there were dozens of animals, but I kept looking until I found him. Charlie was in a cage near the back, pressed against the far corner with his tail tucked between his legs. His beautiful golden coat was matted and dirty, and I could see fresh wounds on his face and legs. But it was his eyes that broke my heart completely. The light had gone out of them. This wasn't the confident, happy dog I'd raised from a puppy. This was a broken animal who had learned that humans were sources of pain rather than love. I wanted to scream. I wanted to charge into that warehouse and tear apart everyone who had hurt him. But I forced myself to stay calm and observe. I needed to understand the layout, the security, the patterns of movement. If I was going to save Charlie, I needed a plan that would work. I counted at least 30 people in the crowd, plus several men who looked like security stationed around the perimeter. Roy Martinez was easy to spot, a heavyset man in his 50s, wearing a cowboy hat and boots, taking bets and directing the flow of money. The fights seemed to follow a schedule with different animals brought out for different events. I watched for 2 hours, taking mental notes about everything I saw. The security guards carried walkie-talkies, but no visible weapons. There was a back door that seemed less monitored than the main entrance. Most importantly, the fights appeared to wind down around 2 in the morning, with people filtering out gradually rather than all at once. When I finally crept back to my car, my hands were shaking with rage and adrenaline. I sat in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner 5 miles away, trying to process what I'd witnessed and figure out my next move. I knew I should call the police. This was clearly illegal, and there were dozens of animals suffering in that warehouse. But Dr. Wells's warnings about Roy's connections echoed in my mind. What if the police were involved? What if calling them just gave Roy advance warning to move his operation somewhere else? I decided to test the waters. I called the non-emergency police line and asked to speak with someone about an animal cruelty tip. The dispatcher put me through to Detective Michael Torres, who listened to my story, with what sounded like bored disinterest. "So let me get this straight," Torres said after I finished describing what I'd seen. "You were trespassing on private property, spying through windows, and now you want us to raid a warehouse based on your word." I have photos I lied wishing I'd thought to bring a camera with a zoom lens. Photos of what exactly dogs in cages that's not illegal, son. People breed dogs for all kinds of purposes. Something in his tone set off alarm bells in my head. This wasn't the response I'd expected from someone hearing about organized animal cruelty. Detective Torres, I saw dogs fighting in a pit while people bet money on them. That's definitely illegal. Look, kid. Torres said, his patience clearly wearing thin. We get tips about dog fighting all the time. 90% of them turn out to be neighbor disputes or people who don't understand legitimate breeding operations. Unless you've got solid evidence of actual crimes being committed, there's not much we can do. What would constitute solid evidence? I asked. There was a pause that lasted too long. Video footage would help. Multiple witnesses. Physical evidence of gambling or animal abuse that would hold up in court. He was asking for things that would be nearly impossible for a civilian to obtain safely. It felt like he was trying to discourage me from pursuing this further. Can you at least check the warehouse? I pressed. Drive by and see if anything looks suspicious. I'll make a note of it, Torres said in a tone that suggested he was already moving on to other things. But unless we have probable cause for a warrant, there's not much else we can do. After hanging up, I sat in my car feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. My family had betrayed Charlie for phone money. The police seemed unwilling or unable to help. The only person standing between Charlie and continued torture was me, and I had no idea what I was capable of doing. I spent the rest of the night researching Detective Torres online. What I found made my suspicions seem less paranoid and more justified. Torres had been the subject of an internal affairs investigation 2 years ago for allegedly taking bribes from local businesses. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but several news articles suggested there were ongoing concerns about corruption in his unit. By sunrise, I had made my decision. If the system wouldn't save Charlie, I would have to do it myself. I drove home and called in sick to work again, then spent the day planning the most important mission of my life. I was going to break into that warehouse and rescue my dog, even if it meant risking everything I had left to lose. I spent 2 weeks preparing for what I knew would be a one-shot opportunity. I bought dark clothing, pepper spray, a crowbar, and a small bolt cutter from different stores around town, paying cash and avoiding security cameras as much as possible. I studied the warehouse layout during multiple nighttime surveillance sessions, timing the security rounds, and mapping every entrance and exit. The hardest part was maintaining normal behavior at home, while my family continued their willful ignorance about what their decision had set in motion. Emma posted daily Instagram stories about the twins' activities with their new phones. Mom hummed while cooking dinner. Dad watched football and complained about his back. Their casual normalcy felt obscene when I knew Charlie was suffering less than 20 miles away. You've been working late a lot, Mom mentioned one evening as I headed out for another surveillance session. Big project deadline. I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. This was the biggest project of my life. The night I chose for the rescue was moonless and rainy, providing extra cover for what I was about to attempt. I parked 8 blocks away and walked to the warehouse carrying my supplies in a black backpack. My heart was pounding so hard, I worried the security guards would hear it from across the parking lot. I waited until 2:30 in the morning when the fights had ended, and most of the crowd had dispersed. Only Roy's truck and 2 other vehicles remained in the parking lot. I'd observed this pattern before. Roy usually stayed late to count money and secure the animals for the next event. The back door had a simple padlock that my bolt cutters handled easily. I slipped inside and immediately had to cover my nose against the overwhelming smell of blood waste and fear. The arena was dark now, but emergency lighting provided enough illumination to navigate between the rows of cages. Most of the animals were sleeping exhausted from stress and trauma. A few watched me with suspicious eyes as I crept past their prisons. I felt guilty leaving them behind, but I knew I could only manage one rescue tonight, and Charlie had to be my priority. I found him in the same cage where I'd seen him before, curled up in the corner with his back to the world. When I whispered his name, his ears twitched, but he didn't turn around. I whispered it again, softer, and finally he lifted his head to look at me. For a moment, I wasn't sure he recognized me. His eyes were dull, and there was no sign of the joyful recognition I'd always taken for granted. But then his tail gave the faintest wag, and I knew he remembered me, despite everything he'd been through. "It's okay, boy," I whispered as I worked on the cage lock. "I'm getting you out of here." The lock was more complex than the door had been, requiring careful manipulation with my crowbar to avoid making noise. Charlie watched me work, occasionally, whimpering softly. I could see more clearly now how much weight he'd lost, how his coat had lost its shine, how his spirit had been systematically broken by weeks of cruelty. When the cage finally opened, Charlie didn't rush out. He had to be coaxed, moving slowly, and keeping his head low as if expecting punishment. I slipped a leash around his neck and led him toward the back door, both of us moving as quietly as possible across the concrete floor. We were halfway to the exit when I heard voices from the front of the building. Roy's distinctive laugh echoed through the warehouse, followed by conversation I couldn't quite make out. I froze, holding Charlie close, praying they wouldn't decide to check on the animals before leaving. The voices got closer, and I heard footsteps moving in our direction. I looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the warehouse was mostly open space with nowhere to conceal a man and a dog. I made a split-second decision to continue toward the back door, hoping we could slip out before anyone noticed. We were 10 feet from freedom when Roy's voice boomed across the warehouse. Well, what do we have here?" I turned to see Roy Martinez standing 30 feet away, flanked by 2 younger men who looked like they spent their free time at the gym. Roy was holding a flashlight that illuminated Charlie and me in a harsh circle of light. "You picked the wrong night for a rescue mission, hero," Roy said, walking closer. "That's a valuable piece of inventory you're trying to steal." "This is my dog," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "He was stolen and sold to you illegally." Roy laughed. "I paid good money for that animal fair and square. Got the bill of sale right here in my office." He patted his shirt pocket. "What you're doing right now is breaking and entering and theft. That's felony territory, son." One of his companions stepped forward. "Want me to call the cops, Roy?" "Not yet," Roy said, still moving closer. "First, I want to know how long this boy's been watching us. Seems like he knows too much about our operation for this to be a coincidence." My mind raced through possible responses, but the truth was, I was trapped. Charlie pressed against my legs, sensing the danger even in his traumatized state. I could smell Roy's cologne mixed with cigarette smoke as he stopped just a few feet away. "Here's what's going to happen," Roy continued. "You're going to put that dog back in his cage, and then we're going to have a conversation about what kind of compensation you owe me for the damage to my property." He gestured toward the broken lock on the back door and Charlie's opened cage. "Breaking and entering destruction of property, attempted theft. That's going to cost you one way or another." I knew I should be terrified, but instead I felt a strange calm settling over me. I'd found Charlie, and I wasn't leaving without him, no matter what it cost me. "I'm not putting him back," I said. Roy's expression darkened. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, boy." "I understand it perfectly," I said. "You're running an illegal fighting operation that tortures animals for entertainment. You bought my dog from people who had no right to sell him, and now you're threatening me to try to keep your crimes hidden." Roy's face went red. "You don't know who you're messing with." That's when I heard the most shocking thing of all, my father's voice coming from the shadows near Roy's office. "Roy, what's going on out here? I heard shouting." Dad stepped into the light wearing the same work clothes he'd had on at dinner, looking completely comfortable in this place of horrors. When he saw me standing there with Charlie, his expression went from confusion to anger to what looked like fear. "Bobby, what the hell are you doing here?" My world tilted on its axis. "Dad, what are you?" "This your kid, Dave?" Roy asked, and I heard the familiarity in his voice. These weren't strangers meeting for the first time. They knew each other well. Dad's face went pale as he realized what I'd discovered. "Bob, you need to leave right now. You're part of this—" I said, the pieces falling into place in my mind. "You've been funding this operation." Dad looked around frantically as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "It's not what you think. What I think is that you helped sell Charlie to people you knew would torture him," I said, my voice getting louder. "What I think is that my own father is involved in this nightmare." Roy was watching our family drama with amusement, clearly enjoying the show. "Well, this complicates things, doesn't it, Dave?" Dad stepped forward, his hands raised as if trying to calm a dangerous animal. "Bobby, listen to me. This is bigger than you understand. You can't just walk in here and disrupt everything." "Everything?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean your investment in animal torture?" "It's not torture," Dad said desperately. "It's sport. It's tradition. People have been doing this for hundreds of years." I looked at Charlie cowering against my legs with wounds covering his gentle face, and then back at my father. "This is what you call sport." "That dog was never going to be a fighter anyway," Roy interjected. "He's too soft. We mostly use him for training the real champions." "Training them to do what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To kill," Roy said simply. "Your little golden boy here helps teach our fighters how to go for the throat, quickly and efficiently." I felt something break inside me at those words. Not just my heart, but something deeper. Some fundamental belief in the goodness of the people who were supposed to love and protect me. "You knew," I said to Dad. "When Mom sold Charlie, you knew exactly where he was going." Dad couldn't meet my eyes. "I thought maybe it would teach you some responsibility. Help you grow up." "By torturing my best friend, it's just a dog, Bobby." The words hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. In that moment, I understood that my father and I lived in completely different moral universes, and there was no bridge between them. I also understood that I was probably about to die in this warehouse, but that I was going to take Charlie with me either way. What Roy and my father didn't know was that I'd been recording everything on my phone from the moment I'd entered the warehouse. The device was tucked in my jacket pocket with the camera lens exposed and the audio recording app running continuously. Every word of their confession was being captured. "You know what has to happen now, Dave," Roy said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Your boy's seen too much. He knows too much." Dad's face went even paler. "Roy, he's my son. We can work something out." "Can we?" Roy asked. "Because from where I'm standing, he just committed several felonies and threatened to expose an operation that makes us both a lot of money. That's not the kind of problem that gets worked out with a conversation." I realized they were discussing whether to let me leave alive. The calm I'd felt earlier was replaced by pure adrenaline as my survival instincts kicked in. I needed to get Charlie and myself out of this warehouse, and I needed evidence that would bring down this entire operation. "Look," I said, buying time while I formulated a plan. "I just want my dog back. I don't care about your business." Roy laughed. "Sure you don't. That's why you spent weeks tracking us down and breaking into our facility. Because you don't care." "I care about Charlie," I said. "That's all." "Well, Charlie's not leaving here," Roy said, "and neither are you unless we can come to some kind of understanding." That's when I played my first card. Detective Torres isn't going to be happy when he finds out you've escalated from animal cruelty to threatening civilians. Roy's confident expression faltered slightly. "What do you know about Torres?" "I know he's been taking your money to look the other way," I said, watching Roy's reaction confirm my suspicion. "I also know that makes him an accessory to everything that happens in this warehouse." Dad stepped forward. "Bobby, stop talking. You're making this worse." "Worse for who?" I asked. "For you, for your business partner here, or for the dozens of animals being tortured in this place?" "It's not torture," Dad insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone, making sure they could see it. Why don't we let a jury decide that I've got hours of video documentation of this place? Roy's hand moved toward his jacket, and I realized he might be armed. But before he could draw whatever he was reaching for, I played my second card. The recordings are already uploaded. I lied smoothly. Automatic cloud backup. If anything happens to me, they go directly to the FBI. It was a complete bluff, but Roy didn't know that. He froze with his hand halfway to his jacket. You're lying, he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Am I asked. Want to test that theory? The truth was, I'd been working with FBI agent Lisa Carson for the past week. After my conversation with Detective Torres, I'd done research and found that federal authorities were already investigating animal fighting operations in our region. Agent Carson had been very interested in my information about Roy's warehouse, especially when I mentioned the potential police corruption angle. I'd been wearing a wire for the past 3 nights, though tonight's recording was just on my phone since I hadn't expected to actually enter the building. Agent Carson knew where I was and when I was supposed to check in. If I didn't call her by 4 a.m., she'd promised to send backup. Here's what's going to happen, I said, projecting confidence I didn't feel. Charlie and I are walking out of here. In exchange, I'll give you a 10-minute head start before the authorities arrive. 10 minutes, Roy snarled. You think 10 minutes is enough time to shut down an operation this size? It's enough time to disappear if you're smart, I said. Which you'd better be, because the alternative is spending the next 20 years in federal prison. Dad was looking back and forth between Roy and me like he was watching a tennis match. Bobby, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the family. I am thinking about family, I said. I'm thinking about how my family sold their son's best friend to be tortured for money. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Dad said, and for the first time he sounded genuinely remorseful. What was it supposed to be like? I asked. Roy said he needed gentle dogs for breeding programs. He said Charlie would live on a nice farm with other dogs. Even Roy looked disgusted by Dad's naivety. Jesus, Dave, you really believed that? The look on Dad's face told me that some part of him had always known the truth, but had chosen to believe the comfortable lie. The guilt and shame in his expression were almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. 10 minutes. I repeated, taking a step towards the door with Charlie. Roy's companions moved to block our path, but Roy held up a hand to stop them. Let them go. Roy, one of the men, questioned. Let them go. Roy repeated, his voice tired. It's over anyway. Too many people know about this place now. I walked slowly towards the exit, expecting someone to stop us at any moment. Charlie stayed pressed against my legs, still too traumatized to show any sign of relief or joy. When we reached the door, I turned back one last time. Dad, I said, when the FBI comes to arrest you, remember that you chose this. He didn't respond, just stood there looking broken and defeated in the harsh warehouse lighting. Charlie and I walked out into the rainy night, both of us shaking from adrenaline and shock. I called Agent Carson from my car and told her it was time to move. Then I drove straight to Dr. Wells' emergency clinic, where she was waiting to examine Charlie and document his injuries as evidence. The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and veterinary care. Charlie's physical injuries were extensive, but not life-threatening. His psychological trauma would take much longer to heal, but Dr. Wells was optimistic that he could recover with patience and proper care. At sunrise, I called my boss and quit my job. Then I called a real estate agent and started looking for a place to rent as far from my family as possible. Charlie and I were going to start over somewhere new, somewhere safe from the people who had betrayed us both. The confrontation with my family was still to come, but I was ready for it. I had evidence witnesses and federal agents backing me up. More importantly, I had Charlie back, and I was never going to let anyone hurt him again. The arrests began at dawn. Federal agents raided the warehouse, Roy's home, and several other properties connected to the fighting ring. They found enough evidence to bring charges against dozens of people, including animal cruelty, racketeering, illegal gambling, and conspiracy charges that would put the main players behind bars for decades. Detective Torres was arrested at his home on corruption charges. The investigation revealed he'd been taking monthly payments from Roy for over 2 years, warning him about potential raids and steering investigations away from the warehouse. His career was over, and he faced significant prison time. My father was arrested at his construction job, led away in handcuffs, while his co-workers watched in shock. The local news covered the story extensively, describing him as a respected local businessman who had secretly invested thousands of dollars in illegal animal fighting operations. Mom called me crying after seeing his mugshot on the evening news, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for either of them. The hardest part was testifying at the trial 6 months later. I had to sit in a courtroom and describe in detail what I'd witnessed in that warehouse, while my father sat at the defendant's table refusing to make eye contact. The prosecutor used my recordings and video footage to build a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. Charlie and I had moved to Colorado, by then renting a small house with a fenced yard near the mountains. I'd found work with a software company that allowed me to work remotely, and we spent our days hiking trails and slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered by his ordeal. Dr. Wells had been right about his physical recovery. Within 3 months, Charlie's wounds had healed completely, and he'd gained back the weight he'd lost. His psychological healing took longer, but with patience and consistent kindness, glimpses of his old personality began to emerge. He learned to trust again, to play again, and eventually to greet new people with cautious optimism instead of fear. I met Amanda at the veterinary clinic where I took Charlie for regular checkups. She was a veterinary technician who specialized in trauma recovery for abused animals, and she understood immediately why Charlie flinched at sudden movements and took time to warm up to strangers. She never pushed him for affection, letting him approach her on his own terms, until he eventually decided she was safe. Amanda and I started dating, slowly building our relationship around our shared love for animals and commitment to protecting the vulnerable. She moved in with us after 8 months, and Charlie accepted her as part of our pack with an enthusiasm that told me he approved of my choice. Roy Martinez was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for running the fighting ring. My father received 5 years for his financial involvement, plus substantial fines that forced my parents to sell their house. Emma and Mom received community service and probation for their roles in the initial sale, though their punishments were lighter since they claimed ignorance about where Charlie was ultimately going. I received a letter from Mom about a year after the trial. She apologized tearfully for everything that had happened and begged me to forgive the family. She said Dad was getting counseling in prison and had finally understood how wrong he'd been. She said Emma felt terrible about her role in selling Charlie and wanted to make amends somehow. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Forgiveness might come someday, but trust was something that once broken so completely could never be fully rebuilt. Charlie and I had learned that family wasn't about blood relations. It was about loyalty, protection, and unconditional love. The day Charlie finally played fetch again was a turning point for both of us. We were hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park, and he suddenly took off running after a stick I'd thrown, his tail wagging with pure joy as he brought it back and dropped it at my feet. For the first time in over a year, he looked like the happy, confident dog I remembered from before our world fell apart. "Good boy," I said, scratching behind his ears as he leaned against my legs. "We made it through, didn't we?" Amanda took photos of us that day that now hang framed in our living room. Charlie looks healthy and content, his golden coat shining in the mountain sunlight. I look older than my years, marked by everything we'd survived together, but genuinely happy for the first time since the nightmare began. The fighting ring bust led to broader investigations that shut down similar operations across 3 states. Dozens of animals were rescued and rehabilitated. Dr. Wells started a non-profit organization to help fund recovery programs for fighting dogs, and Amanda and I became regular volunteers. We kept in touch with some of the other families whose pets had been sold to Roy's network. Most of the animals were eventually reunited with their original families, though some had been too damaged by their experiences to fully recover. We formed an informal support group that met monthly to share updates and resources for helping traumatized pets heal. 2 years after the rescue, Charlie became a certified therapy dog. His gentle nature and obvious resilience made him perfect for visiting hospitals and nursing homes, where his presence brought comfort to people facing their own difficult battles. Watching him provide healing to others helped complete his own recovery journey. I think often about what would have happened if I'd listened to my family and gotten over it, as they'd suggested. Charlie would have died in that warehouse, used and discarded by people who saw him as nothing more than a tool for training killers. Dozens of other animals would still be suffering. Roy's operation would still be running, and the corruption that protected it would still be hidden. Standing up for those who can't protect themselves is never easy, and it sometimes costs more than we think we can afford to pay. But the alternative is allowing evil to flourish while we look the other way and tell ourselves it's not our responsibility. Charlie taught me that love means fighting for someone even when the whole world tells you to give up. It means choosing what's right over what's convenient, even when that choice isolates you from people you thought you could count on. Most importantly, it means understanding that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. These days, Charlie greets each morning with the same enthusiasm he had as a puppy, his trauma transformed into resilience, and his pain into wisdom. He's taught me that healing is possible even after the worst betrayals, and that trust can be rebuilt with patience and consistent kindness. We've created a life filled with mountain hikes, cozy evenings by the fireplace, and the kind of peaceful happiness that can only come after surviving something you weren't sure you'd get through. Charlie has everything he needs: a warm bed, regular meals, medical care when he needs it, and humans who would rather die than let anyone hurt him again. Sometimes I wonder if my family ever thinks about what they lost when they chose $1,600 over loyalty and love. But mostly I'm just grateful that their betrayal led us to discover how strong we really were, and how beautiful life could be when built on a foundation of genuine care and protection. Charlie's story became a reminder that justice is possible, that the vulnerable can be protected, and that sometimes one person's refusal to accept cruelty can change everything. He showed me that fighting for love is always worth the cost, no matter how high that cost might seem at the time. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what you knew was right? Have you ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who might need to hear Charlie's message of resilience and hope. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember that love is always worth fighting for, even when the battle seems impossible to win.